This is the code in action video for Chapter 12. In Chapter 12, we learned how to use Redux in combination with React hooks. We started out by migrating our small to-do application to Redux and then moved on to implementing Redux in combination with hooks. In the first code example of Chapter 12, we implemented a Redux store using the create store function from the Redux library and our existing app reducer. We then pulled out the dispatch function from the store and created an effect hook to manually subscribe to the Redux store. As we can see here, we are simply subscribing to the store, and whenever anything changes, we set the new state and then pass this state on to our other components. This is not a very efficient way to use Redux, but it shows us how Redux works internally. In the first code example, we have implemented Redux by using an effect hook to update our state from the Redux store. So instead of using a reducer hook, we're now passing our app reducer to the Redux store, and as you can see, our application still works the same way as before. In the second code example of Chapter 12, we actually implemented Redux properly, but the traditional way, so we did not use hooks here. We first defined action types, which are basically the names of different actions. Then we define action functions, which return action objects, or asynchronous actions, which call the dispatch function. Next, we created a configure store file where we create the store and apply the func middleware, which allows us to use asynchronous actions. Then we modified index.js and used the provider component from React Redux to connect our application to Redux. We then defined various container components for our existing components, which have a map state to props function and map dispatch to props function. And then we connect our existing component to Redux via these two functions. The first function returns state from Redux, and the second function binds the action creators, which are these action functions here, and to the dispatch function. So basically we can call fetch to-dos and it will automatically dispatch an action after the bind action creators was called on it. So what this allows us to do is this function here allows us to inject state into our components, and this function here allows us to inject action creators into our component, which will not just create the action object, but automatically dispatch it as well. We also created the same for all the other components. And as you can see, for example, to filter, it returns the current filter from the state. The components pretty much stay the same way as before. They simply get the action creator or the corresponding state, as you can see here, and make use of it for handling the state and dispatching actions for actions creators. In the second code example, we have set up Redux the traditional way by using connectors and container components to connect our existing components to the Redux store. As we can see, our app still works the same way as before, but we are now using Redux properly, the traditional way, to implement our app. In the third code example of Chapter 12, we implemented hooks into our Redux application. So instead of using container components, we can see that there's no more containers folder. So instead of using container components, we now use hooks from Redux. If we take a look at one of the components, we can see that we use the use dispatch hook from React Redux, which gives us the dispatch function. We can then use any of the action creators to create an action and then dispatch it as follows. And as you can see, we also use the same in the app component, which makes our app component much simpler because now the whole logic is in the reducers and our app component basically just uses the dispatch function. We also did the same for the filter. Here we also use the use selector hook, which allows us to get apart from the Redux state. So for example, here we define a function, a selector function, which takes the state and returns state.filter. So we get the filter from our state, and then it just simply returns the value, and we can use it like any other value from any other hook. As we can see, using Redux in combination with hooks makes our code much simpler, more concise, and we don't need to deal with container components anymore. Of course, it is possible to use container components for some components and use selectors and dispatch hooks for other components. You can mix and match them, just like you can with React class components and React function components with hooks. So there's no need to migrate everything at once, but once you see fit or once you implement a new component, feel free to use the hooks instead. In the third code example, we have implemented Redux using hooks. So we're not using container components and connectors anymore, but we are now using the use selector and use dispatch hooks to connect our application to Redux. As we can see, the application still works the same way as before, but we are now using hooks to connect our application to Redux. In the fourth code example of chapter 12, we implemented reusable selectors using the reselect library. First installed the reselect library, and then we used the create selector function from it in the to-do list component. Reselect library allows us to create selectors that can be reused. Additionally, they will be memorized, so they will only recompute values when the state changes. The create selector function also allows us to combine multiple selectors, so we can define a to-do selector which gets the to-dos from the state, a filter selector which gets a filter from the state, and then we can use create selector to use first the to-do selector, then the filter selector, and then we can get the results of both, so the to-dos and filter, and then filter our to-dos based on the to-do list and the filter that was selected. So if the filter is active, we return only the active to-dos, and otherwise we only return the completed to-dos, or we return all to-dos. So this logic is the same as before, but we are now putting it into a reusable selector function, which the selector is called select filter to-dos. We can then use the reusable selector like any other selector function by passing it to the selector hook from React Redux. So we can get the filter to-dos by doing use selector and then select filter to-dos. And this makes our code much cleaner. We can also use the select filter to-dos in other components now. And additionally, it gets memorized. So the filter to-dos do not get recomputed unless the state actually changes. In the fourth code example, we have used a reusable selector to implement the filtered to-dos. So now we're not always filtering the to-dos again anymore, but we are using a memorized reusable selector function, which we can use again if we need filtered to-dos in another component. As we can see, filtering and the whole application still works the same way as